Ukraine is not advancing. Ukraine is administering a military education. And Russia, after 3 years of absorbing that curriculum through catastrophic losses, still has not learned the most important lesson, that the assumptions holding their entire defensive architecture together were not just wrong, they were structurally, irrecoverably wrong from the beginning. What you are watching right now is not a territorial gain on a map. It is the visible, measurable collapse of a doctrine. And if you understand what that distinction means, you will understand why this latest liberation is not a headline, it is a verdict. Let me tell you what actually happened. And more importantly, let me tell you why it was always going to happen. In a window of less than 96 hours, Ukrainian forces dismantled a Russian defensive line that Moscow had spent months fortifying, repositioning, and, critically, publicly presenting as a stabilized front. The territory recovered was not symbolic frontier territory. It was operationally significant ground, logistics adjacent, elevation advantaged, and positioned to pull the seam of the broader Russian defensive posture further back than any single engagement has achieved in months. Russian forces did not hold. They did not conduct an organized fighting withdrawal. They ran, and the speed of that collapse, the actual kinetic speed of Ukrainian advance against a supposedly entrenched defense, is the number that should stop every analyst who has been describing this war as a frozen stalemate. This is not a story about Ukraine taking land. This is a story about what happens when one side's military doctrine finally meets the reality it was designed to deny. Pull the lens back, because this requires context that the headlines will not give you. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, the operational assumption embedded in their planning was not bold. It was inherited. It came from a Soviet-era doctrinal framework that treated mass, momentum, and combined arms shock as the decisive variables in modern land warfare. The idea was simple: overwhelm the defender before they can adapt, fix them with fires, collapse their command architecture, and the political will follows. That model worked in specific historical contexts. It worked in the assumptions of generals who had not fought a peer-contested combined arms war in decades. What it did not account for was an adversary who had spent 8 years from 2014 to 2022 studying exactly that doctrine and building the specific counters to it. Ukraine did not improvise its defense in the first weeks of the invasion. It executed a preloaded counter doctrine, and Russia walked directly into it. The early phase of the war exposed the first layer of Russian miscalculation, the belief that Ukrainian will was fragile. That was not just wrong, it was catastrophically wrong in a way that cascades, because when you build an operational plan around the assumption of rapid political capitulation and that capitulation does not come, everything downstream of that assumption begins to degrade. Your logistics are wrong. Your reserves are positioned for exploitation, not sustained attrition. Your command and control is structured for an advance, not a grinding defense. And your soldiers, told they would be welcomed or face a brief fight, begin to understand that their officers misled them about the fundamental nature of the war they are fighting. That psychological fracture inside the Russian military is not a soft variable. It is a force multiplier against their own effectiveness. And we are still watching it compound. By the autumn of 2022, the shape of the war had already revealed something that I want you to hold on to because it explains everything that followed. Russia's operational concept had shifted involuntarily from maneuver warfare to positional attrition. That is not a minor adjustment. That is a doctrinal collapse. Maneuver warfare requires initiative, speed, and decentralized execution. Positional attrition requires mass, logistics depth, and industrial sustainment. Russia had neither in the quantities the new model demanded, and they lacked the institutional culture to execute the former effectively, even when they had fleeting opportunities. Ukraine, meanwhile, was doing something Russia's doctrine never planned for: learning faster. That phrase is worth stopping on. Learning faster. It sounds simple. It is, in military terms, one of the most decisive asymmetries possible in a sustained conflict. When one side's tactical failures consistently convert into doctrinal adjustments, and the other side's tactical failures consistently convert into repeat operations with the same assumptions and the same outcomes, the trajectory of the war is not uncertain. It is a mathematical function. And the output of that function is what you just watched on the map. Now, let me walk you through what this actually means at the operational level. Because the liberation you just saw did not happen because Ukraine got lucky with a gap in the line. It happened because Ukrainian forces applied a sequenced, multi-domain degradation campaign against the specific enablers of that Russian defensive position before the ground assault ever began. This is the variable the mainstream coverage consistently misses. The map changes you see reported as a single event are actually the final, visible output of an intelligence-driven, fires-led preparation that began days or weeks before the first Ukrainian infantry crossed the line of contact. By the time Russian defenders realized the assault was coming in force, their command nodes had already been struck, their logistics arteries had already been interdicted, and their ability to call for and receive reinforcing fires had already been systematically degraded. This is what modern combined arms warfare actually looks like when one side has learned to execute it and the other side has not. The outcome looks sudden. The preparation was methodical. Let me give you the numbers that matter here. In the 72-hour window preceding the primary ground advance, Ukrainian strike assets registered confirmed hits on at minimum 4 Russian forward logistics points servicing that section of the front. Ammunition pre-positioned for defensive fires was destroyed before it could be used. Fuel supply that would have allowed armored repositioning was eliminated. And critically, the Russian electronic warfare assets that had been partially degrading Ukrainian drone reconnaissance in that sector were specifically targeted and taken off the network. What that means in plain operational terms is this. By the time Ukrainian ground forces moved, the Russian defenders were not just outnumbered in the assault corridor. They were isolated. They had degraded communication with their higher command. They had degraded ability to call and adjust fires. They had degraded capacity to maneuver armored reserves because the fuel and the routes servicing those reserves had already been addressed. And they had no reliable picture of where the main effort was coming from because Ukrainian ISR had been restored and their own reconnaissance capability had been eliminated. And it gets even more serious from here because what I have just described is not a one-time Ukrainian innovation. It is now a replicable operational template. And Russia has demonstrated repeatedly that they do not have an effective answer to it, not because the individual components are unknown to them, drone strikes on logistics, suppression of air defense, ISR-enabled fires, but because executing that kind of integrated, sequenced, multi-domain preparation requires an institutional culture of decentralized initiative, cross-domain coordination, and adaptive planning under uncertainty that the Russian military at the unit and formation level structurally does not produce. This matters enormously because what it means is that the capability gap is not a function of equipment counts alone. It is a function of organizational culture. An organizational culture in a military institution does not reform itself under combat pressure. It entrenches. The habits that got you to this point become the habits you fall back on when the pressure increases. And for Russia, those habits are centralized command, rigid planning timelines, fear of initiative at lower echelons, and an overwhelming preference for mass over precision. Ukraine has been systematically exploiting every single one of those institutional weaknesses, not accidentally, deliberately. Pull the lens back further, because what is happening now at the tactical and operational level is beginning to express itself at the strategic and industrial level in ways that make the trajectory of this war clearer than most commentary suggests. Russia's defensive architecture in the liberated area was not just a collection of positions, it was a system. It depended on specific command relationships, specific logistics pipelines, specific artillery coverage zones, and specific unit rotations to maintain coherent defensive integrity across a long front. When you punch through that system, not just penetrate it, but actually collapse the coherent integrity of it in a section, the consequences are not local. They are lateral. The units on either side of the breakthrough corridor are now exposed on their flanks. Their own defensive posture, which was calibrated to assume a stable adjacent position, must now be adjusted. That adjustment requires reserves. Reserves require logistics. Logistics require routes. And every element of that reallocation sequence is observable by Ukrainian ISR assets and targetable by Ukrainian long-range fires. This is the compounding logic of positional collapse. One successful liberation operation does not just take ground. It creates geometric instability in the defensive system around it, and that instability is not resolved quickly when the side experiencing it has the organizational and logistical deficits I have described. Now, let me address something directly because it comes up every time there is a significant Ukrainian advance: the question of sustainability. The argument usually sounds like this: Ukraine can make gains, but Russia has depth. Russia has manpower reserves. Russia has industrial capacity ramping up. Therefore, these advances are tactically impressive, but strategically indecisive. That argument contains a grain of structural truth wrapped around a fundamental analytical error. Yes, Russia has territorial depth. Yes, Russia has demonstrated an appalling willingness to absorb human losses at a rate that should horrify anyone with a conscience. But depth and mass are not the same thing as effectiveness. And the ability to feed men and equipment into a failing system does not repair the system's failures. It amplifies the costs of those failures. What the Russia has depth argument consistently misses is this: every kilometer of front that Russia must now defend with degraded units, disrupted logistics, and compromised command is a kilometer that is consuming their finite reserve capacity. The reinforcements being rushed to plug the hole left by this liberation operation are reinforcements that are no longer available to stabilize a different section of the front, support a different operational axis, or provide the kind of operational reserve that a healthy military holds back for decisive exploitation. Russia is not husbanding strategic depth. Russia is consuming it, one emergency reallocation at a time. And the rate of consumption is accelerating. Because Ukraine's operational tempo, the speed at which it can identify, prepare, and execute these liberation operations, is not static. It has been improving. The integration between Ukrainian intelligence assets, long-range fires, drone networks, and ground maneuver formations has become demonstrably more fluid over the course of this war. The planning cycle has compressed. The execution has become more precise. And the exploitation phase, the ability to hold and expand gained ground before Russian reserves can stabilize a new line, has become faster. This asymmetry in operational tempo is, in my assessment, the single most important military variable in this war right now. Not equipment counts, not territorial positions on a static map, operational tempo. Because operational tempo is the function of organizational learning, and organizational learning is the function of culture. And as I have already established, these two sides are not on equivalent cultural trajectories. Let me now bring you to the operation itself, the turning point moment, the specific sequence of events that converted a prepared degradation campaign into a historic territorial liberation. The assault began in the pre-dawn hours, specifically chosen for the overlap between degraded Russian thermal surveillance capability and a meteorological window that Ukrainian planners had identified as suppressive of Russian rotary wing response options. That is not luck. That is precision operational planning informed by multi-domain intelligence synthesis. The kind of planning that requires institutional competence at the formation staff level. Ukrainian assault elements moved in multiple axes, deliberately designed to force Russian local commanders to make allocation decisions under communication stress. This is a specific and advanced tactical technique. You do not just attack where the enemy is weakest. You attack in a pattern that forces the enemy to make bad decisions about where to allocate their limited response capacity. And when those decisions are being made by commanders who are already operating with degraded communications, degraded situational awareness, and degraded fire support, the quality of those decisions predictably collapses. The primary breakthrough occurred at a point in the line that Russian defensive planning had assessed as a secondary priority. That assessment was based on terrain analysis that was accurate by the standards of conventional positional warfare, but failed to account for the specific mobility adaptations Ukrainian light forces had developed for exactly that terrain type. This is doctrinal asymmetry in its most direct form. Russia was defending against the attack they expected. Ukraine executed the attack that Russian doctrine said was not possible. Within 4 hours of initial contact, Ukrainian forces had not just penetrated the line, they had bypassed two separate Russian strongpoint complexes, leaving them cut off from resupply and reinforcement, and had reached the first operational depth objective, terrain that commands observation over the key Russian logistics route servicing the entire sector. The Russian response at this point is the most instructive part of the entire operation, and I want you to understand it precisely because it reveals something fundamental. The response was slow, not by minutes, by hours. The delay between Ukrainian exploitation of the initial breakthrough and the first coordinated Russian counteraction was measured in hours, not minutes. In modern combined arms warfare, an exploitation window of multiple hours is not a delay. It is an operational gift, and Ukraine used it with exactly the kind of disciplined, sequenced advance that their pre-operation planning had prepared for. Why was the Russian response so slow? Not because the commanders did not understand the danger, because the system for generating a rapid, coordinated response was not there. The reserves were not positioned for rapid commitment. The authority to commit them without higher approval was not delegated to the local commanders. The communications architecture to coordinate the response was already partially degraded by the preparatory strikes, and the fuel and ammunition required to move and fight the reserves had been interdicted in the pre-assault phase. Every single one of those gaps is a direct consequence of the doctrinal and organizational failures I described earlier. They are not random misfortunes. They are the predicted outputs of a military culture that cannot generate the kind of rapid, decentralized, initiative-based response that modern combined arms warfare demands. Russia knew what was needed. Their institution could not produce it. That gap between knowledge and capacity is the definition of a structural military failure. By the end of the 96-hour operational window, the liberation was not just complete, it was being consolidated. Ukrainian engineering assets were already improving the logistics routes servicing the new line. Observation posts were being established on the commanding terrain, and the intelligence fires integration that had enabled the initial assault was already being reoriented toward the next prepared Russian defensive position to the east. The operation did not end with liberation. It ended with preparation for the next operation. That sequencing, the immediate conversion of a successful action into preparation for the following action, is a hallmark of a military that has internalized the operational initiative rhythm. It is not something Russia's current force can replicate at the unit level, and that asymmetry is not closing. Now let me deliver the verdict, because this is what the operation actually means at the strategic level, and this is what history will record about this moment. Russia began this war with a doctrine built on the assumption that mass, momentum, and political shock would produce rapid, decisive results against an adversary assumed to be organizationally inferior. Every one of those assumptions has been empirically disproven, not once, but repeatedly, across multiple operational phases, across multiple seasons, across hundreds of engagements at every level of warfare, from squad to army group. What you watched in this liberation operation is not the exception to that pattern. It is the latest and most emphatic confirmation of it. Ukraine is not just taking territory. Ukraine is administering repeated, documented proof that Russia's military institution, not its equipment, not its manpower, not its territory, its institution, its culture, its doctrine, its decision-making architecture, is the side of this war that is fundamentally broken. And broken institutions do not repair themselves under the pressure of the consequences of their own failures. They compound. The decisions made under stress by a failing institution are worse than the decisions that created the failures. That dynamic is visible right now in how Russia is managing its reserves, its rotation cycles, its logistics, and its command relationships along the entire front. Not just in the liberated sector. Everywhere, Putin ran not because he chose to. He ran because the system he built, the system his generals inherited and entrenched, gave him no other option at that moment in that sector against an adversary that had prepared specifically to make every other option unavailable. The question now is not whether Ukraine can continue to execute operations of this type. It demonstrably can. The question is whether Russia can find within its institutional culture the kind of adaptive capacity that would be required to develop an effective answer to the multi-domain degradation and exploitation template Ukraine has now refined into a repeatable operational system. Based on everything visible in the evidence of 3 years of this war, the answer to that question is no, not because Russian soldiers lack courage, but because the institution above them lacks the organizational DNA required to generate the kind of decentralized, adaptive, initiative-based response that the answer demands. You cannot reform a military culture under the pressure of losing. You can only perform the culture you have. And the culture Russia has is the culture that produced every catastrophic failure visible in this war. That is the larger pattern this operation confirms, not a tactical success, not even an operational breakthrough in isolation. A visible, measurable, ongoing proof of structural failure on one side and structural adaptation on the other. And structural asymmetries of this kind in military history do not reverse themselves through territorial depth or manpower replenishment alone. Stay with this channel, because the next operation is already being prepared. And when it unfolds, you will need the framework to understand what it actually means, not what the headlines say it means. The difference between those two things is the difference between watching this war and understanding it. And that difference is exactly what we are here to give you.